Imagine a single man with a chilling charisma igniting the fuse of the most devastating war in human history. This man was Adolf Hitler, a figure who would become synonymous with terror and destruction. But how did a humble Austrian-born man rise to become the Führer of Germany and ignite the flames of the Second World War? Hitler's early life was filled with struggle. Born in Austria in 1889, he was a mediocre student, and his dreams of becoming an artist were squashed by a stern father. After his father's death and a failed stint at an art school, Hitler found himself living a life of vagrancy in Vienna, a time which he later claimed was when his anti-Semitic views took root. In 1913, Hitler moved to Munich, and when the First World War broke out, he enlisted in the German army. He served with distinction, but the war's end left Germany in ruins, both physically and economically. The Treaty of Versailles, which ended the First World War, was particularly harsh on Germany. The nation was saddled with war reparations it could not hope to pay, and its pride was wounded with the blame for the war. This created a vacuum of frustration and resentment, a fertile ground for Hitler's extreme ideologies. Then came the Great Depression in the late 20s, a global economic catastrophe that hit Germany especially hard. Millions were unemployed, and the nation was on the brink of collapse. Hitler and his National Socialist German Workers' Party, or the Nazi Party, promised a way out. They promised jobs, food, and most importantly, they promised to restore Germany's lost pride. In 1933, Hitler was appointed Chancellor of Germany. His rise to power was swift and absolute. He dismantled the democratic Weimar Republic and established a totalitarian regime, the Third Reich. Thus began an era of darkness, as Hitler's shadow loomed large over the world. With a world plunged into chaos, Hitler's war machine began its deadly march. The stage was set for a conflict that would span continents and claim millions of lives. The first major event of the war was the invasion of Poland. In September of 1939, Hitler's forces stormed the country, marking the beginning of his territorial expansion. This blitzkrieg, or lightning war, was a strategy that focused on speed and surprise, leaving Poland's defenses in tatters and the nation in Nazi hands. From there, the war machine rolled on. May 1940 saw the invasion of France. The German forces bypassed the heavily fortified Maginot Line, sweeping through the Ardennes forest and taking the French by surprise. Paris fell in June, marking a dark chapter in French history. Meanwhile, across the English Channel, the Battle of Britain raged in the skies. The Royal Air Force valiantly defended their homeland against the German Luftwaffe in a conflict that would determine the future of free Europe. In the Pacific, Japan had been expanding its own empire. The infamous attack on Pearl Harbor in December 1941 brought the United States into the war, marking the beginning of a bloody conflict that would span the Pacific Ocean. In Europe, the Holocaust was underway, a systematic genocide that would claim the lives of 6 million Jews. This horrific event is a stark reminder of the depths of human cruelty and the dangers of unchecked power. On the Eastern Front, the Soviet Union was locked in a brutal struggle with the Axis powers. The harsh winter and fierce Soviet resistance turned the tide of the war, leading to some of the most brutal fighting in human history. The world was in turmoil as nations fell one by one to the Axis powers. But this was just the beginning of the story. The tide of war was about to turn as new alliances formed and the world prepared to fight back against the Axis onslaught. But even in the darkest hour, a glimmer of hope emerged. As the war raged on, there were significant turning points that began to shift the balance. One of the most critical was the Battle of Stalingrad. The city, bearing the name of Soviet leader Joseph Stalin, was more than just a strategic objective, it was a symbol. The German army was determined to capture it, not realizing they were walking into a trap. The Soviets, despite suffering heavy losses, held on with grim determination. The battle turned into a war of attrition, and eventually, the German forces were encircled and defeated. It was a devastating loss for Hitler and marked the beginning of a series of Soviet victories. Now let's turn our attention to the Western Front. The D-Day invasion was another pivotal moment. On June 6, 1944, the largest amphibious assault in history was launched by the Allies. Thousands of ships, aircraft, and men stormed the beaches of Normandy, France. This daring operation cracked open Hitler's fortress Europe, providing a much-needed second front against the Axis powers. It was a gamble, a massive risk, but it paid off. The D-Day invasion marked the beginning of the end for Nazi Germany. But the war was far from over. The Battle of the Bulge, the last major German offensive on the Western Front, was yet another turning point. In a desperate attempt to push back the advancing Allies, Hitler ordered a surprise attack through the densely forested Ardennes region. The initial assault caught the Allies off guard, creating a bulge in the front line. However, the Allies regrouped, and after a brutal fight in freezing conditions, they managed to repel the German forces. This defeat marked the end of Germany's ability to launch large-scale offensives. Slowly but surely, the Allies began to turn the tide. Despite the cost in lives and resources, these battles marked a shift in momentum. The Axis powers were on the defensive, and the end was in sight. As the Allies closed in, Hitler's dream of a 1,000-year Reich crumbled. The year was 1945, and the tide of the war had drastically turned against the Axis powers. Hitler's vision of a global empire was fading fast as the combined might of the Allies bore down on the heart of the Third Reich, Berlin. Fierce battles raged in the streets of the German capital. The city, once the epicenter of Hitler's grand design, was now the stage for the final act of the Second World War in Europe. As the Soviet Red Army advanced from the east and the Western Allies from the west, Berlin was reduced to rubble. In the midst of the chaos, Hitler, the man who had brought the world to the brink of annihilation, found himself cornered. His grandiose plans had unraveled, his allies had deserted him, and his once invincible Reich was on the brink of collapse. In a bunker beneath the churning streets of Berlin, Hitler made his final decision. On the 30th of April, in a desperate act of defiance, he took his own life. The man who had once held the world in his grasp was gone, leaving behind a legacy of destruction and despair. Hitler's death marked the end of the Third Reich. A few days later, on the 8th of May 1945, Germany officially surrendered to the Allies. The fall of Berlin, the death of Hitler, and the end of the Third Reich marked the conclusion of the war in Europe. The world breathed a sigh of relief. But it was a victory that came at a tremendous cost. The destruction was immense, the loss of life catastrophic. The world had been forever changed by the horrors of the Second World War. The war in Europe was over, but the scars of the conflict would remain. The end of the Third Reich marked not only the conclusion of the war, but also the beginning of a new era. An era in which the world would have to confront the consequences of its past and strive to build a future free from the horrors of war. In the aftermath of the war, societies around the world were forever changed. World War II, a cataclysmic event that left no corner of the globe untouched, dramatically altered the course of history. The end of the war marked not only the cessation of brutal conflict, but also the beginning of an era of profound transformation. Take Japan, for instance. A nation once known for its military prowess found itself under a new constitution that renounced war as a sovereign right. The land of the rising sun, stripped of its military might, began to rise again, but this time through a different channel: culture. Out of the ashes of war-torn Japan sprung a vibrant and unique form of art known as anime. This explosion of creativity resonated across the globe, transforming Japan from a feared military power into a beloved cultural powerhouse. And let's not forget the establishment of the United Nations. This international body was born out of a collective desire for peace, a shared commitment to prevent the atrocities of World War II from ever happening again. The UN became a beacon of hope, a symbol of a world united in its pursuit of peace and prosperity. But even as the world strived for peace, the seeds of another conflict were being sown. The ideological divide between the capitalist West and the communist East marked the beginning of the Cold War. The world had barely caught its breath from one global conflict when it found itself on the brink of another. Yet, even this tension spurred progress, leading to advancements in technology, science, and even space exploration. From the ashes of World War II, a new world order emerged, forever shaped by the events of this monumental conflict. The transformation of societies in the aftermath of the war is a testament to the indomitable spirit of humanity. It's a reminder that even in the face of the most devastating adversities, we have the power to rise, to evolve, and to forge a new path forward.